But I've been looking forward to this all week because we have a really interesting pair of studies that we're going to be discussing. One is more near term, what's happening right now with the world of work and how workers are feeling about telework, things like that, and what they're expecting moving forward. But then Lee also has some research that's a little bit more futuristic, thinking more long term of, say, 2025 moving forward, what the world of work is going to look like. So we're kind of going to ping pong off both of those studies and those themes. But again, if you have any questions and you're joining us, please let me know. I'll incorporate those into the discussion as well. So Kim, I'll start with you. It's obvious that the pandemic has had a big impact on the world of work. Talk to me a little bit big picture what your research found in terms of how people are feeling about this shift, particularly when it pertains to working remotely.
Right. So it was a shift. The shift to telework was dramatic and swift, and occurred for many of us over a year ago. We left our offices and brought supplies to get us through for about 2 weeks, and here we are still at home. So it was a big change for folks. And I think there's no doubt that it accelerated a trend that was moving pretty slowly towards telework. So we did a survey back in October, really in the height of the pandemic. And we asked people who said that their jobs could, in theory, be done from home, how often they had been teleworking before the coronavirus outbreak started. And about 20% said that they had been working from home all or most of the time. And then we said, well, what about now in October? What are you doing? And 71% said they were working from home all or most of the time. So that's obviously a huge increase. But then more importantly, we asked them, well, what about when this is all over? What do you think you're going to want to do? And we found then that a majority said they'd like to still work from home all or most of the time. So that right there sort of shows you that there wasn't, they weren't eager to go back to that 20% figure. They weren't eager to go back to the before times. And so I think that's something that now everybody's talking about. Employers are trying to adjust to that and make plans for the future. It is important to note, though, that for most American workers, working from home isn't an option. Most people don't have teleworkable jobs. And in our survey in October, we found that 62% of the workers we talked to said that their jobs could not be done remotely. And those workers tend to be in lower wage jobs. They tend to be less educated. And obviously, they faced a whole different set of challenges and circumstances during the pandemic. I know today we're going to focus more on the experiences of people that made the shift to telework.
Well, yeah, let's talk a little bit about those. I think it is important to note that I feel like the media, myself included, pay a lot of emphasis and attention on those who are able to work remotely. So let's stay for a beat on those who don't have this option. Lee, talk to us a little bit about your research in terms of some of the inequity issues that this pandemic has brought up in terms of those who have this ability, those who don't, what that means for their careers moving forward.
Thanks so much, Caroline, and it's wonderful to have you joining us for this. It's very exciting to make this connection. So the work I'm going to describe is a bit different from what Kim was describing. It's not a public opinion survey as much as it's a canvassing of a lot of experts. We asked them to think about the year 2025 and what might be happening in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And we asked them, would like it mostly better, mostly worse, or not change much? And there was a pretty split verdict among them. It's not a scientific sample, but it's a 916 experts responded to this canvassing. And 47% said mostly worse, 39% said mostly better, and 14% said not too much difference. One of the topmost things on their minds, partly because we asked this question relatively soon after the killing of George Floyd, were all sorts of issues related to social justice and social equity. And they talked about three sort of big mega trends that set the stage for all the stuff that's going to be happening in the next 5 or 6 years. The first thing they talked about is that the pandemic basically was an accelerant for a lot of technology trends that were already underway. And they talked about, many of them actually used the phrase, a tele-everything world. Where a lot of remote processes were embraced aggressively once everybody had to shelter in place and go home. Telework, telemedicine, virtual schooling, a lot of commercial activity, and a lot of social activity. And so they think that there might be a snapback in the years between our emergence from the pandemic in 2025. But in many respects, these trends are now embedded in people's lives in telework, and they are thinking that the people who don't have the option of telework or aren't necessarily well trained to embrace these new technologies might even fall further behind their fellow citizens when it comes to being prepared for the workplace, being adaptable and flexible and resilient in the workplaces. The second trend they talked about was just sort of more technology in everybody's lives. There's been a lot of talk about the rise of the Internet of Things, lots of smart gadgets, lots of smart systems that are in place. And they felt that the pandemic itself pushed more people to reliance on these systems. And they think now that we're heading into a future where a lot more education and learning platforms, or a lot more health-related platforms, telemedicine and things like that, and certainly a lot more platforms related to social interactions virtually rather than in person are going to take place. And the
Right.
final thing they talk about, which we can talk about later on, is basically they think that, like all things related to technology, this embrace of the tele-everything experiences, or moving more into a tele-heavy world, will bring out the best and worst in people. So they talked about increased connectedness and how that might tie to empathy that people have for each other. But it also meant that the connectedness could be tied to misinformation, info wars, weaponized information, disinformation, and things like that.
Well, I definitely want to get to later, Lee, how we get to that former world and not the latter, and perhaps some of what the experts had to say about that. Kim, this like tele-everything world that Lee's describing, it's assuming that people have structures in place at home where they can work from home effectively. I'm curious, with the survey that you did most workers, and like you just said, it happened overnight. This wasn't something that was any company could prepare for. Were most workers, was the transition smooth into this all remote work environment that a lot of people are still experiencing today?
It was really interesting to see how smooth it was. So it definitely wasn't seamless for workers, but the shift was, relatively smooth for most of the workers that we interviewed. And so among those folks that said that they were working from home all or most of the time, large majority said that it had been very or somewhat easy for them to have the technology and equipment that they needed to get their job done, to meet deadlines and complete projects, to have adequate workspace. All of these things that I think people anticipated were going to be major roadblocks or stumbling blocks for people. People transitioned into them pretty easily. And we also found majority saying that they were able to get their work done without interruptions, and that they were able to feel motivated to work, which I think are, some things that employers might have had, concerns about. On those last two items, though, being able to get work done without interruptions and feeling motivated, we did see some differences along demographic groups. So younger workers were more likely to say that this had been a significant challenge for them, either, getting their work done without interruptions or feeling motivated to work. And there was sort of an under 50, over 50 age split, which I found really interesting. And then on the getting work done without interruptions, no one will be surprised to hear that working parents found that particularly challenging. And I have some data about some of the specific, responses that we got from working parents that, were pretty interesting and enlightening, and kind of speak to that unique experience that many of them had during this period.
Yeah, let's take a minute and spend a little bit of time in both of those buckets. I thought it was really curious that younger workers did say that they had a hard time with this transition. And Lee, I want to hear from you too on this, because you would think that, the younger workers are the ones who can adopt this technology the quickest, or may be able to do this. There are some stereotypes that could come into play there. So what specifically were the challenges the younger workers were facing, Kim? And then Lee, if you have any commentary on the same topic, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, we didn't ask specifically about the challenges they were facing, but another thing we found with people who were new to telework was that they really missed those social connections and the personal interaction that they had in the workplace. And, that it may be that was a bigger anchor or a bigger motivator for younger workers. We don't know. We also would assume that those workers under 50 are more likely to be working parents and have young children at home. So I think that those two things, the age demographic and the parental status, kind of went hand in hand with some of these findings.
A bunch of the experts, matter of fact, a pretty large number of them, also talked about the emerging challenges for leaders in this environment, managing workforces now that have a different structure, different relationships to the home office or the in-person experiences. We're in the midst of a really giant social experiment now that is going to involve a lot of trial and error. These managers expect, and these experts expect, And it's going to be driven to some degree by some of the worker expectations that Kim was describing. A lot of people now think it's a plus factor for a job to have at least some capacity to do telework, and managers are worried about productivity. They're worried about equity issues. Might people in the home office be treated differently from people who are only able to engage remotely? They were worried about sort of the coordination costs of this. I mean, one of the bigger bumps in the road, as Kim described it, was literally making sure that everybody was on the same page and doing the right things. And so there's this sort of palpable sense among these experts that particularly the bosses they're talking to are in a brand new sort of landscape, and they don't know how to navigate it. And there isn't a literature that teaches them what's best to do in person, what's okay to do in virtual time. So we're going to be in the midst of this giant experiment about how this is all going to sort out.
And, Kim, speaking of some of the equity issues that Lee was just describing that a lot of leaders are facing with right now, obviously your survey was done in October when we were in a very different place in the pandemic, but childcare centers across the country are still shuttered. About 20% of them are still not open yet because of just talent shortages and people not wanting to go into those frontline jobs right now. Specific to working parents and equity issues, what are their concerns? Kind of where are we with managers effectively managing that talent pool? What do they need right now?
Yeah, so on that point I had made earlier about, the basic thing of trying to get your work done without interruptions, we saw that huge gap among workers who were parents of kids under 18 in the home and workers who weren't. And half of the workers with kids at home said that this was a significant challenge for them compared to only about 1 in 5 of workers without kids at home. And interestingly, we found that mothers and fathers were equally likely to say that this had been an issue for them. But when we asked more specifically about who actually had childcare duties while they were trying to get their work done at home, there we found a big gender imbalance. So mothers who were working at home all or most of the time were much more likely, and had children in the home, were much more likely to say that they were providing a lot of childcare, sort of, you can imagine, kind of hands-on childcare, helping with remote school or taking care of a very young child. 36% of mothers said that they were providing a lot of that care, and only 16% of fathers did. So we did see some gender inequity there. And then we had some other questions that we asked about sort of, career interruptions or changes that people might have experienced during the pandemic because they had these childcare responsibilities. And we found that more than half of working moms said that they had felt like they couldn't give 100% at work because of the, sort of trying to balance their work responsibilities with their family responsibilities. And 43% of dads said the same. So there were also a significant share of moms who said they'd had to cut back their hours because of sort of all of these trade-offs, and they were more likely to say that than dads. So there were definitely some gender inequities, but we saw significant, kind of stress and interruption for moms and dads.
Right. And Lee, the experts have any advice or thought on how we're going to solve this? I think what's top of mind for me is that, you just talked a little bit about how we're in this social experiment where managers are having to figure out in real time how to fix these day-to-day problems. But these are larger problems that, looking out 5 years from now, they kind of need to be thinking ahead too. So how are they dealing with the current crisis while making sure that some of the future crises that you outlined earlier don't happen within their workplace?
They are confused about it more than they give a lot of specific advice. The other factor that is going on in lots of workers' minds, in addition to the stuff that Kim has described, I'm calling the "you only live once" experience, where the pandemic was such a gigantic disruption to people's lives that they're sort of, you can feel them taking stock of what it meant for them and their place as workers, and generally what it meant for them and their place in life and getting meaning out of life. So another team at the center, a team that studies spiritual life and how it impacts sort of public activities and attitudes of workers, found that about a quarter of Americans said their faith deepened, and about 85% said that there was a message to be derived from what we were going through in the pandemic. And so managers have to have that in mind too, as they're thinking about the disruptions in workers' lives and sort of the restoration slightly more intact workplaces as people get back together again. So part of this is trial and error. As I said before, a lot of these experts sort of say we're going to figure out, and it might even be different organization by organization, but figure out when in-person gatherings are really great and do a lot more work than remote gatherings, and when remote stuff can be a sufficient substitute for that. I've talked to two major public policy groups in the past couple of weeks, and the other thing that's going on with them is that in political jurisdictions, I've talked to some state information officers, licensing, professional licensing is administered by states. So what are they going to do now when pharmacists and physicians and nurse assistants and things like that start offering their services over state lines? How are we going to navigate that kind of thing? So there's more disruption ahead is, I guess, the basic message they're saying. And there isn't a roadmap quite yet for how, even individual organizations might work their way through it.
And Kim, I guess my question to you off of that is, what did the survey data say in terms of, obviously people still want to continue to have the option to telework, but the adoption of all these technologies, being on Zoom all day, is that something that workers adopted well? Are they suffering from Zoom fatigue, as we've all heard at one point during this pandemic? And do they want to continue to do everything like this virtually?
Yeah, we were really interested in learning more about that. So we did ask about that in our survey. And first, just to give some context, we found that about 8 in 10 workers said that they were using these online conferencing services like Zoom and WebEx, which we're using today. More than half, about 60%, said that they were using instant messaging platforms like Slack. And so it was, widely utilized, obviously needed to be in order for people to keep in touch. And among our survey respondents, 60 those who were working from home, 65% said that they thought these technologies were a good substitute for in-person contact. So you've got 35% saying they weren't a good substitute, but the majority saying that they were. And then we asked people specifically about the amount of time that they spent in online conferencing, whether they felt fine about the amount of time or whether they were really worn out by it. And again, we found more than 60% saying they were okay with the amount of time they spent, 37% saying that they were really worn out. So that 37% is not an insignificant share, but it's not a majority either. So people, seem to be adapting and just kind of dealing with it. And, again, just to go back to that, the figure saying that it was a good substitute for in-person. So I think to Lee's point, people are going to make decisions going forward about when do you really need that in-person contact and when can you substitute with these other technologies. And it's just going to be, a process that everyone will have to go through and kind of reckon with as we transition back into the office.
Right. And Leah, what I thought was both exciting and also terrifying about what those nearly 1,000 experts told you is that Zoom is just the beginning here. There's a lot of technologies that could be coming into our lives, particularly the lives of teleworkers moving forward. Talk to us about some of the technologies that the experts outlined and what it could mean for the future of work as we think about, a few years out, 10 years out.
One technology that was a lot on their mind, and I'll use air quotes around it, was literally education and training itself, to the degree that the reckoning that's going on now sort of adds itself to the long-term conversations about the future of work. There were a lot of these experts who talked about the reconfiguration of education systems, higher ed and beyond, just because now these new platforms were available where people could dip in and out of a course or take a single sort of credentialing activity online and then move ahead with their employers. And job training itself is likely to be amplified by things like artificial intelligence. Certainly virtual and augmented reality are now being increasingly employed, according to these experts, in lots of training and workplace programs. The other things that they talked about were, again, sort of accelerants of things that were already underway. Facial recognition is going to get better. Voice recognition is going to get better. We're going to be able to, according to them, to be able to search videos as adeptly now as we can search text-based products. They talked a lot about the flying Internet of Things, how deliveries and surveillance systems are going to be sort of drone-based in many respects in the future. They talked about the medical Internet of Things, where lots of diagnostics, lots of gathering material, sort of taking stock of vital signs and things like that will be available to us, and marking our nutrition and our fitness and things like that. So there's a sense that all these technologies will be added to our bodies. And the final thing that was really sort of on a lot of these experts' minds, in part because a lot of them are academics, is privacy itself. To the degree that we're relying on these technologies to help us do work, it also gives the owners of the technology and the employers who use the technology new ways to sort of mark what their employees are doing and gather up new evidence about, when were they online? How much were they doing? When were they off? What kind of technologies were they using? And so there's a sense that the sort of social contract between employers and employees is really in flux now, as well as the broader social compact between sort of citizens and the government about what programs are necessary.
Right. And hearing Lee speak, Kim, about that social contract, it has me thinking just about job satisfaction overall. Has the pandemic and the flexible work that now teleworkers are experiencing, is that leading to more job satisfaction, less job satisfaction? How are workers feeling?
Yeah, well, I wanted to build off of one point that Lee made on this sort of access to technology and training from a survey that Lee and I worked on in 2016. So, definitely pre-pandemic days. We know that there's been this huge appetite on the part of workers for more training. At that time, we found a majority of workers saying that they felt like they were going to need more skills and training in the future to stay relevant in their careers and in their jobs. So I think that this, hearing what the experts say and knowing now the access that we have to technology, this could really accelerate that access to skills and training that we know workers have been craving. And we're seeing in surveys now all these figures about how people want to change their jobs, change industries, and they need that training and they need those skills in order to do that. So I think that's, it's another accelerant to a trend that we knew was already underway. What was your question again, Caroline? Because I got off on a tangent.
I asked you about job satisfaction. Is the advance of all this technology, is that leading to more or less job satisfaction from workers? Yeah.
So we were really interested in sort of the way that this shift to telework had affected the culture of work. And again, what we found was that, we didn't see wholesale change from things like job satisfaction, number of hours people were working, the flexibility they had, the productivity, their work-life balance. Majority said that these aspects of work hadn't really changed for them from pre-pandemic days to, in the throes of the shutdowns and the pandemic. So that was really interesting. And I think we expected to see more change. When we broke it down and looked at people who were working in person or teleworking, and particularly people who were new to telework during this period, that's where we saw some clear sort of upsides and downsides to the transition. We saw that, I had mentioned this earlier, a lot of workers who were new to telework said that they really felt less connected with their coworkers. So that was a downside for them. The upside was having more flexibility in when they could work their hours. And about half of new teleworkers said that this was something that had really changed for them. And, but on the other hand, about a third of them said that they were actually working more hours. So, maybe they value that flexibility even if they are having to work more hours. And we've known and seen in our research prior to the coronavirus outbreak that it's really flexibility that workers have craved. We did a big study a few years ago on paid family and medical leave, and we asked people, what types of workplace policies would be most helpful to them in their lives. And flexibility trumped having paid medical and family leave. Like, that's what people really want. They want to be able to decide when they can work their hours, not necessarily work fewer hours, but have the freedom to decide how it can fit in with the rest of their life. And I think that's sort of the genie that's out of the bottle now with this change. And that's what's going to be really hard for people to go back to a more standard, a more predictable workday and workplace and all of that. So that's what I think is going to be really interesting to see going forward.
Yeah. And Lee, the experts painted some pretty dystopian realities that could be in the near future if employers don't get this right and we don't figure this model out correctly. One that just came to mind, hearing Kim, was just the mental health concerns of further social isolation, as people are feeling like they're not connected to their coworkers. They're spending a lot of time in small rooms like this in their home alone. Talk to us a little bit what the experts said there in terms of the concerns if we continue to have large swaths of the population working in isolation, basically.
Yeah, they expressed a variety of concerns related to this. The first is just related to well-being. It's pretty well documented that a portion of the population was truly suffering as workplaces sort of vanished and they had to work from home, and they lost portions of their social networks in part of that process. And so there's a sense among these experts in particular that as in a hybrid world where there's at least some telecommuting as well as some in-person work at offices, the withering of that kind of social support at the workplace in particular is going to take its toll. The other thing is more generally about people's sort of relationships to their communities. As people sort of had to retreat to their homes and to isolation in one way, shape, or form, there was a sense that some people could cope with it well. They had good networks, they had nice family support systems, they had neighbors who would help them out and things like that. Other people sort of were deeper in deficit when they needed help, when they needed someone to get them somewhere, when they needed help with a meal or to pay a bill or things like that. So it definitely fits into this very, very broad story about the bifurcated or not necessarily equitable distribution of how these things are going to play out in the culture. The final thing that they talked about was actually the sort of upside of some of the pandemic experience was that teleconsultations it turned out to be relatively well, and that the model of telehealth and engagement with medical practitioners, mental health as well as others, might be enhanced in the future as people and insurance companies and providers themselves get more comfortable with that kind of interaction.
Got it. I just want to tell everyone who's joining us in the event, I'm seeing some questions trickle in, and I'm going to open up the mic to them in just a couple minutes. So if you do have questions, let us know, and we'll transition to that in a few minutes here. Kim, I guess one final question for you. You do this work all the time. What was the most surprising finding to you from the survey? And obviously the survey was in October. I'm interested if you have any insight into, how these trends are changing or what Pew is going to be looking at moving forward.
Yeah, I think, most interesting to me and somewhat surprising, which we've touched upon, was the sort of relative smoothness of this transition for many of the workers who went through it, and just sort of speaks to the adaptability of workers. But then again, you do see these pockets of struggle and dissatisfaction. So, we definitely don't ever want to discount that. And we haven't talked much at all about the workers who did still have to go to their workplaces and report in person. And even back in October when things were, so scary out there, those workers, large majorities of them were having a lot of contact in person with people. They were really concerned about their safety. And, that was very kind of eye-opening and poignant to see in our survey responses. But at the same time, a lot of them were really satisfied with the efforts that their employers were taking to keep them safe. So that showed, sort of a lot of goodwill on the part of employers too, and just people trying to work through all of these issues together. And in terms of the future of our work, we're very interested to see how this transition is going to play out. So we're planning to do more work on this over the next year, as we know that people are going to be returning to the workplace, and just see, what the new normal becomes, what are the expectations on the part of employees. And as I said, like, now that people have had a taste of this flexibility and maybe a little bit more balance in their lives, it'll be interesting to see if they're willing to go back to something that's, more restrictive and maybe less conducive to a more sane work style.
Well, Kim, I think I speak for your dog who's behind you taking the most adorable nap, that he's probably very excited that you're able to work from home, and would hope for that to continue in the foreseeable future. Lee, anything that we didn't hit on from your analysis with the experts that I think would be important for people to know before I open it up to questions from people joining us?
Thanks, Caroline. There was one sort of line of argument that was a fresh one to me as we've engaged with these experts on a lot of questions over the years. Yes, they are concerned about privacy, more surveillance, rearrangement of capital and labor in the favor of capital, and particularly the power of technology companies and things like that. But a pushback against that argument was that to the degree that people have become facile with these tools and that they've become more attuned to how they can be used for good, these experts were sort of saying there's a way to push back. There are ways for individuals and collectives of individuals and networks of individuals to push back, to use the very tools of surveillance or tools of empowerment to bigger, particularly technology companies. There are a lot of folks who said, no, we're actually the balance of power might be shifting in favor of individual actors or people who are sort of pushing back against systems that they worry might be oppressive.
Yeah. Such a good point, and I just hope that we don't get there because it's, again, pretty dystopian, some of the stuff those experts were saying, Lee. All right, I'm going to get some questions here from the stream. Okay, this one's from Patrick. He's wondering, did your interviews give any clue to why the quit rate would increase as we move to the new normal? So, back to what, Lee, some of your comments about YOLOing, any insights into that from any of the research?
Again,
Not
sort of
really.
the experts would.
Oh, go ahead, Lee.
No,
you go ahead, because I was going to say we don't really in our survey have much of a clue about that. So I don't know if the experts did.
Well, a bunch of experts talked about this moment as being phase 2 of what happened in the 2008-2009 recession, at least in terms of workers' calculations and reckoning with their own skills, their own employability, the fate of their industries and things like that. There's now a sort of second wave of that going on, particularly with younger workers who were being educated right after the Great Recession of 2008-2009. And there's a sense that these workers now can have more tools in their hands to get things done, and they have a new set of calculations in their heads. I mean, as Kim was talking about flexibility and convenience, I was thinking, and these experts made a lot of references to it, the other side of the calculation that argues for flexibility is I don't have to commute as much as I used to before, or I can live in a community that is removed from the congested downtown area I was living in. And there was a lot of chatter among these experts about essentially redesign, reimagination, deurbanization that might be going on in some cities. And that's also part of sort of people's calculations about why this new world might have some advantages for them.
Yeah. Anything to add there, Kim, before I move on?
No, I was just going to say we also have done some looking at folks that lost their jobs and were unemployed during the pandemic, and even people that were in more vulnerable industries and occupations. And, they were very pessimistic in January about getting a new job. And, about 2/3 of the unemployed workers that we talked to said that they had seriously considered changing occupations or fields in order to probably just to try to stay relevant in this labor force. So I think people are also making calculations about what the future will look like for those industries that may never come back in their full form to what they were before. So that's in the back of people's minds as they're thinking about picking up new skills or retraining or reimagining what their future might look like.
Well, speaking of that reimagination, there's a comment here from Lily, and maybe your past research into unemployed people and those switching jobs maybe can speak to this. She says, remote work creates an even greater pay differential by the time we consider commuting and the cost of commute. As remote work is broader, do you think a part of that push will create towards greater hourly wages that's associated with this added cost of having to commute? I don't know if any of the research had anything about what workers are expecting when it comes to pay.
No, we didn't really ask about that. We are interested in the impact that all of this has had on income inequality and wage inequality in particular, and it's something that we're going to be looking at in the future. We know low-wage workers were hit particularly hard in that early wave of layoffs in the early months of the pandemic. And, many of them, as we found in our survey of the unemployed, are still looking for work. So I have a feeling that this, our research obviously isn't fully underway yet, but I think this will have an impact on wage inequality going forward. I don't know if that really addresses the question or not, but it's definitely something that we're interested in.
Great. The other thing to remind everyone about some of that nice work that Kim has been doing over the years, there's a very bifurcated sense among the better educated and higher income workers about the need to stay up to date and the need to be lifelong learners and things like that. The second thing that was so striking in the survey that Kim referred to that we did in 2016 was at the abstract level, a lot of workers know that disruption is on the way and that certain kinds of jobs are in deep jeopardy heading into the future. But it was surprising the degree to which most people thought their own jobs would survive. They think that they are so special, or their contribution to the workplace is so great, or that there's just something extra about the kind of job that they do that they don't feel as jeopardized as they sort of say the rest of society should feel. And that's particularly true, actually, of some of the workers in lower income jobs. They are not necessarily having a sense that they can adjust their training for the future, and they certainly don't, in some cases, have a sense that their future is in jeopardy, as some others think it might be.
Well, there's another question here from Lynn that has to do with CEOs, specific to leadership, maybe getting into some of the leadership concerns that Lee, you were hitting on earlier on in the discussion. But she asks, what do you think it will take for CEOs who still think everybody will just come back to work after July 4th or Labor Day and go back to normal and realize that something has deeply fundamentally shifted about work during the pandemic? I don't know if you have any insight from the experts there about what this is going to mean for the war on talent. I think, what we're seeing on LinkedIn is 70% of companies are talking to us about talent shortages that they're experiencing right now. There is definitely a war for talent that's only getting worse. And so I think the companies that don't offer these flexible arrangements are likely going to be in trouble come July 4th or Labor Day, when they do say, okay, all these workers have to return. It's definitely, from the research, Kim, that you did, it's definitely not what the workers want to just have to go back overnight again.
Right. I mean, people seemed to see the biggest upside to all of this as the added flexibility that was coming with teleworking. So that wouldn't, and then just the basic numbers about the share saying that even after this is all over, I'd still like to work from home all or most of the time, was a majority. So yeah, they didn't seem eager to go back to the before times. And yeah, we don't have any data on leaders, corporate leaders or business leaders, and how they're making their decisions. But I know, internally in our organization, there's quite a dialogue that's gone on between managers and employees about, what's going to be best and how to move forward. And we're making adaptations and changes. So Lee, I don't know what you've heard from your experts, but I would assume those conversations are going on all over the country.
Yeah. And it's somewhat for these experts, and particularly the way we frame our questions, the conversation and the tension is at a higher plane. I mean, these are tech experts. We ask them tech-related questions, so they have technology on their minds, and that's the whole reason we're talking to them. And as techlash has built in the past 6, 7, 8 years, where people are more concerned about the power of technology companies, more concerned about censorship by technology companies, more concerned about their capacity to sort out misinformation from correct information, more interested in thinking about regulation of technology companies, that the companion conversation that's right along with that is sort of the future of capitalism. And it is bound up with the question of whether heading into the future, artificial intelligence and robotics is going to wipe out more jobs than it creates. It's bound up with a question about the disjunctures that Kim is describing, and the workers that she's describing are thinking about. Some jobs are sort of great and have nothing but a upwards trajectory, and others of them seem very bleak. And so it's already bound up with that. So I'm not sure what CEOs are thinking, but if they're reading the culture right, this stuff is swirling around them. And it's in some cases, these experts would say unavoidable for them to confront.
Great. All right, Kim and Lee, we have tons and tons of questions coming in, so I'm going to get to as many as possible. So I'm going to instruct my lovely panelists to keep their answers on the briefer side. But this one's from Bridget. She says, I'd be really curious if Lee could expand on what he meant by workers gaining more power in a new economy. How so? What did you mean by that?
Using these tools, I mean, it was more in the context of surveillance, sort of the regular workers and regular citizens being able to call to account those in power and those who have decision-making authority to use the organization tools that they've got to actually do the surveillance and monitoring that, or just plain old fact checking and fact hunting that workers can do now with these tools. So it's more about that kind of sort of power imbalance or power restoration or sort of rearrangement of power rather than sort of job specific benefits and tasks and things like that.
Sure. And then this one's probably for you, Kim. August is asking, have you seen any signs of grievance or disconnect among workers who are unable to work from home? If yes, is that disconnect directed at least in part to folks who are able to work remotely? Basically, is there angst among people who couldn't work from home against people who could work from home during this pandemic?
Yeah, I don't think I can answer that directly. I mean, as I said, it's most American workers that can't work from home. And we did ask them sort of a specific set of questions about what their experiences and concerns were in the workplace during the pandemic. One interesting finding was that we found that lower income workers were sort of less satisfied with the steps that their employers had taken to protect them, and also more concerned about exposure to the virus back when, you know, this was a big deal back in October. So they had angst around those issues, their own safety and protection, for sure.
Great. And let's see here. Kate wants to know, thanks for talking about how the pandemic exacerbated gender inequity. Could you please talk about how the past 15 months could be affecting the future of racial inequity in the workplace?
That's a big topic to tackle. I know that, speaking of the workers who were in person during the pandemic and working in the midst of all of that, we did find that Black and Hispanic workers were more concerned about their own health and exposure to the virus. And I don't know if that had to do with concerns in their own communities or concerns given the specific occupations that they were working in. So that was a big issue going forward. We do have some recent data where we've been looking at representation in STEM occupations and diversity across racial and ethnic groups and by gender. And it's not directly on point, but we can see in those STEM occupations that Black and Hispanic workers are still underrepresented across a whole range of STEM clusters of jobs, particularly engineering and computer jobs. And the same is true for women as well. So those are issues that you know, are going to be quite relevant in the future as those fields become more important. And we know that those are high wage occupations as well. So that's a big equity area going forward.
Absolutely. I reported on a study from Slack recently that actually discovered that Black workers in particular are more likely wanting to work from home because of just all the microaggressions and challenges that they faced in the physical office before. So my conversations with CEOs are pointing in that direction too, that this is going to be a huge priority in terms of ensuring that the inequities that a lot of these experts pointed out don't continue to get exacerbated as we do return to office.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, this is from Bonnie. Do you think that business owners will offer more training opportunities, or do they expect employees to get credentials on their own? I guess, Kim, are employers responding finally to that demand for new skills that you guys saw? What was it, 2016 or 2017?
Yeah, 2016. Yeah, we don't have data on employers specifically, so I don't know, but we know that the appetite is out there. It was out there for workers pre-pandemic, and we can see now with all the disruption that's occurred in the labor force that people are, you know, even more eager now to gain new skills and training. So, yeah, if the pressure is coming from the workers, I assume that the employers will respond. When we did ask in that 2016 survey about where people would go to get additional skills and training, they were more likely to say they'd go outside of the workplace, seek education, either a higher degree or a special certification or something like that. They weren't necessarily looking to their own employers to provide that training.
Although we did also sort of get some nice insights from them about what are the attributes for themselves and for the firms that they go to that will be most important for the future. Understanding computers and doing well with computers ranked high, but then in second place, tied for second, as I remember it, was being able to work in a diverse workplace and all of the advantages that are pretty well documented in the social science on that for everybody involved. And the third thing was finding a place that offered training. So again,
Mhm.
it's not necessarily happening in workplaces, but now workers understand that employers that think about this are at an advantage.
Mhm.
Seeing a few more questions, but I think we're going to have to call it there for the sake of time. Thank you, Kim and Lee, so much. I learned a lot in our conversation. I'm sure everyone who joined us did as well. I really appreciate you taking the time. And that concludes our event for today. But Tanya, our lovely host, is telling me that if you have any further questions or want to get in touch with the expert, you can email her directly at the email that she sent you about the event. So you can go ahead and do that. And with that, Lee, Kim, great to see you in face. And oh, one more comment that I have to bring up before we close. Not really a question, but I enjoy watching the two dogs behind Kim. That's one advantage of working from home. So we got a lot of dog fans joining us right now, Kim. So thanks for that. But in all seriousness, thank you both, and see you on the other side.